Uncuckables.
Hello. I'll just bring you up on the screen here. Oh. Have you got video?
Oh, no, I didn't switch it on. How's that?
That's good. Everybody, please meet Simon Roche. He's the director of Suidlanders, which is a organization, or I'll let you explain it, in South Africa. What do you do?
Well, very simply, Tim, we are a civil defense organization constituted under international law. The Geneva Conventions govern the prosecution of war. They have protocols additional to them which govern the circumstances of civilians in war. And those protocols additional to the Geneva Conventions make specific provision for identifiable ethnic groups to plan for a crisis in which they may be directly threatened. Now, clearly, the threat in South Africa is that if there is a civil war or an event of similar nature, it will naturally fracture along racial lines. That's the kind of, almost the sine qua non of the South African deal, as it were. So we, as white people, as Afrikaners, as conservatives, are Suidlanders, and our plan is to safeguard the welfare of our civilians in a time of civil war.
Now, you and I have spoken before on my old show, The Unshackled Waves, but you haven't spoken with David Hiscock, my co-host who edits the XYZ. So I'll let Dave pick your brains for a bit first.
Hello there, Simon. Thanks for coming on The Uncuckables. Nice to meet you.
Yeah, nice to meet you too, Dave. Thank you for having us.
You're very welcome. I've seen you in the past on Stefan Molyneux, and I was listening to your interview recently on Red Ice Radio as well. So you're doing a great job getting the word out about the plight of South Africans. So great stuff.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. So just on that, like what you're describing, what Suidlanders do. So do you find that you have to tread a line, because you guys can basically see what's coming? It's like you're in Europe in the 1930s, and you can see that things are going to go down, but you can't sort of go, okay, we're actually going to form a military organization, but you actually have the right to actually say, okay, we can actually defend ourselves. This is self-defense. We're not doing something which is an aggressive act here.
Yeah, we have to tread a very fine line, because clearly, we're such a minority, Dave, that if or when, the way things are looking now, and as we're being promised by black leaders, we will be slaughtered. There have been a few utterances in the past few days from extremely senior, influential black leaders. When such an event happens, it's going to come down to blood and iron, as was it Paul von Hindenburg said. Not Paul von Hindenburg, I'll come across the guy's name shortly. So for now, we can't prepare nuclear submarines and aircraft carriers and cruise missiles and what have you. That's completely out of the question. But what we can do is bring people together into little groups and regional groupings and what we call provincial groupings, and empower them with the knowledge of how to escape from dangerous zones, how to form convoys, what sorts of radios you should purchase, so that we all have completely, saturated communication in a time like that, when cell phone repeater towers obviously won't be working, what sort of food you should prepare for yourself, get the coordinates for a safe area or an area to meet, to gather in, or an area to camp over a weekend where a hostile population might be very sparse, and get people to trade contact details with one another, so that I know who my buddies are in my town, who's thinking like me. If a crisis comes, what can we do and remain within the law? I think that hopefully answers your question.
Yeah, absolutely. Here in Australia, like on XYZ, and also the Unshackled, we've covered a lot of what's going on in South Africa. And aside from just the obvious, just as a human being and as a fellow European, like feeling sympathy for the situation. We see what's going on in South Africa, and we fear that this is what could happen in Australia in a generation's time. So it's interesting to see the way that you're going about this, because this could be a model for Australians to actually, if we become a minority and things actually go a similar way, it could be a model for Australians to follow as well.
When we last spoke,
Well,
it was December 2017, which it was still, I know you'd done a lot of media with Stefan Molyneux and other alt media personalities, but it became a big political story in Australia, what was happening to the white farmers in South Africa early 2018, when one of the major journalist Paul Tui went over to South Africa, and there are actually quite a few successful rallies in Australian cities to have white South African farmers come as refugees to Australia. The most successful one was in Perth, because that's where a lot of white South Africans who'd come from there had migrated to Perth because it was so close to where South Africa was. And so there was a lot of sympathy for the plight of the white farmers, but of course the left, Australia's left, which were caught off guard, they simply managed to beat the politicians who were advocating this down, saying that they were falling for a white genocide conspiracy theory, and that this was harking back to the White Australia policy.
Well, it's absolute nonsense. Look, it's really not difficult to work out. For many years, the government refused to release the statistics of the murder of farmers. They released them for the first time on, I believe, I want to say Thursday, the 6th of May last year, and they were released on the Friday, and they were reported on the Saturday. In any case, since then they've been updated once or twice. Now, if you go through the names, it's not hard to tell if there's a black man there. There's a pretty big difference in names, you know. So you can tell what proportion of the people murdered on farms are white. And it was all but one, right? We know the number of white farmers in South Africa fairly closely, not precisely, but we have a very, very good idea of the number of white farmers. If you multiply the proportion by 100,000, in other words, if you say that 25,000 farmers goes into 100,000 4 times, so multiply the 46 white murdered farmers by 40, I beg your pardon, by 4. A child could do it. That's 184 per 100,000. Whether the left, whether the liberals, whether the scientists at the universities, whether the sociologists, whether the mainstream media, whatever they think, the simple reality is that is higher than the mortality rate in Yemen now, in Syria now, in Libya now, in Afghanistan now, in Iraq now. I'm very sorry to get so worked up, but it is detestable that these people manipulate simple arithmetical facts for their political agenda. And you know, that is not even to speak of the rape of little girls on these farms. A few weeks ago, a father was taking his daughter to school, and they were accosted at the main farm gate by 4 men, and they got them out of the pickup truck, the ute as you would call it, and they forced the father to watch while they raped this 13-year-old girl, 4 men. And there are many other such incidents. Shortly before that, a mother was attacked on the farm with the children in the house. I think there were 3 kids, if I'm not mistaken. And after they raped the mother, they grabbed the 11-year-old daughter to rape her. And again, 4 men. And the mother pleaded to the point where they said, all right, we won't rape your daughter on one condition, that she watches us rape you for a second time. And if she turns her head away, and if she closes her eyes, this is all on record. If she turns her head away, or if she closes her eyes, then we are going to rape her. So tell her nicely now that her welfare depends on watching closely while we do what we do to you. This is on top of the murders. And then you hear about these liberals who deny it, and it's a conspiracy theory, and it's a bullshit story, and what have you. It's evil, man. It's evil. These people are evil.
Yeah. Well, yeah, your rage is justified. I've had conversations with people here in Australia who believe that what's going on in South Africa now, like if you get past the denial, they see it as payback for apartheid. They're that brainwashed here in Australia that they think that you guys deserve it, and it enrages me as well. Like what you're describing as well here, not just the numbers and not just the ratio, not just that high ratio, 100, what is it, 182 per 100,000. It's the intent with which they're doing this. Like, because we hear story after story like this. This isn't just like one or two stories that you're telling. Like every time that I hear about the murders in South Africa, they're like this. They don't just shoot them in their head. It's like what you're describing here.
Yeah, you know, David, the thing is that this argument, this payback argument, is well and good, but we just crossed the threshold of 500,000 murders since apartheid. And right now, the murder rate in South Africa is 35.9 per 100,000 people. That is across the entire population. So you can firstly see that the murder rate of the farmers is very, 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 very much higher. So there's something specific there. Right. I'm going to run through a couple of things quickly.
Sure.
The rate of rape of women is 110 per day.
Whoa.
Right. Now, I ask you, with the tears streaming down my face, how, excuse my language, is that the rape, the mutual rape and murder of black people, this complete lawlessness, this anarchy, this chaos that prevails in this country, when a black person kills another person, a black person, at a rate that was completely unknown during apartheid, how is that a consequence of apartheid? So it's a payback for whites, all right, well and good, but how do you explain 110 mostly black women raped a day? How do you, come on, you scientists, you geniuses at the universities, how do you explain that? How do you justify the killing of foreigners that has been happening in South African streets the whole of the beginning of last week, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday? There was a rampage of South African blacks against foreign blacks, that is to say Nigerians, Congolese, Zimbabweans and Mozambicans particularly, but not only, through the streets of Johannesburg and Pretoria. These people being hacked to death. I can WhatsApp you some photographs and some videos, if you like, being burnt to death, having their eyes plucked out, all on video. You know, these guys have got an answer for every bloody thing, these liberals. But at the end of the day, none of their answers make sense, because even if you reduce it to whites, even if you say, well, we can't explain why there is this reign of terror in the black townships, but as far as the whites are concerned, it's payback for apartheid. Then I ask you, how is it that the number of murders that has been proven to be a part of apartheid, from the time that apartheid began until the time that it ended, the number of murders perpetrated against black people that could be attributed to race, the most generous number, the most exaggerated number, is 36,000. In all of those years, 36,000. I'm not saying that's great. What I'm saying is that then maybe we should make it tit for tat. We limit it at 36,000. Is this how we should approach it? The number of black women raped under apartheid, we make a tally and then we limit it at that. It's the same as the expropriation without compensation of land. The government wants to take land throughout South Africa, but it's a matter of scientific fact that there were no Bantu people, that is to say the black people of South Africa, the Zulus, Xhosas, Tswanas, Basotho, Baswati, and so on, west of the Great Fish River. So if that land was never stolen, how is it that it should be repatriated? You know what I mean?
Yes, absolutely.
These arguments, I know I'm waxing a bit lyrical here, but these arguments that the Liberals present are so fallacious that it's enough to give you a stroke, man.
Yeah, it's something that we face and we deal with every day. We raise this sort of stuff. It's like people have a barrier in their mind and they just dismiss it all as conspiracy theories. It's like they essentially live in a world of alternative facts.
I've noticed now that Wikipedia, because that's just become a leftist manipulation encyclopedia, and so they mentioned the white genocide conspiracy theory and that South Africa is part of it. And it's interesting to note that their response to that is South Africa is one of the most dangerous places in the world, and so it's dangerous for everybody. And you think, hang on, who's in charge of South Africa now? It's the African National Congress. So they're not doing a good job at keeping that nation safe.
It doesn't really fit the narrative of the Rainbow Nation.
Yeah, Rainbow Nation. Yeah. South Africa post-apartheid, Mandela in 95, it was supposed to be the Rainbow Nation. And of course, there are the riots and the black-on-black violence that's happening now.
Yeah, none of it makes sense. And, part of the problem, Tim, is intellectualism in Western society. Christian-based, let's say the Christendom-derived societies have become infiltrated by intellectualism. And one classic example is the work of Margaret Mead in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. You may have heard of her. She worked under France Boas. She went to the South Sea Islands. She did a whole lot of research. She came back and she said, it's categorically provable that there are no racial differences beneath the skin, as it were. No racial differences. All human beings are on average just the same. All sheepdogs are just the same on average as all Jack Russells. And she said the same about gender. And we now live in a world in which people actually believe that, but black people don't believe that. If you speak to black people in South Africa, they rely far more highly on intelligence and wisdom than intellect. We live in a society in which people get fed absolute rubbish, and they will believe it. And you see people on, let us say, for example, the television news, who speak with a certain gravitas, a certain cachet, and they speak absolute tripe. Clearly, it's an intellectual, not an especially intelligent person, not an especially wise person, but they have just enough capacity to ingest this absolute rubbish and then regurgitate it. And that phenomenon is found far less in, for example, Eastern Europe, in the Middle East, in East Asia, and I'm not familiar with South America. I've never traveled there, and far less in Africa. You can't tell. There's a saying in the USA: "Who are you going to believe, me or your lying eyes?" Now, as a white person, as a Westerner, as somebody who comes out of European society, my answer every time is, well, of course I'm going to believe you. I'm never going to believe my own eyes. How could I ever possibly, And that goes to what Tim was saying. People believe absolute rubbish. They believe anything that gets fed to them. If you go onto YouTube now, sorry that I'm holding the floor like this, but if you go onto YouTube now, people are discussing this massive gold and silver increase in price that's kind of happening overnight. They're discussing the mortgage bond crisis in Australia. They're discussing the negative yields on treasury bonds in the USA. They're discussing negative mortgage rates in Germany and Denmark. And you've got two sets of opinions. The one is CNBC, MSNBC, NBC, ABC, CBS. And the other is a 180-degree different opinion. The one is saying that everything's okay. The other is saying we're all, everything's going to implode. And so the mass media feeds this narrative that is kind of like an opium of a sort that placates the masses and leads them by the nose into, terrible situations. And then you've got a few stubborn holdouts like you guys who are saying the absolute contrary.
Yeah, what you're talking about is how people we use the expression "the red pill." It's a meme, but it works. You take the red pill and you see how the world really works, and that's the process that we've all gone through. It goes through stages, and sometimes it takes years. Sometimes it all comes in a big rush. What's great about the last few years is that it sort of climaxed with the Brexit vote in Great Britain and Trump's election in the United States. It's like there was a mass red pilling across the West, and now the clamps have come down from the censors, so they're trying to basically contain it. But you can't stop that now. There's enough of us now that we actually see the world how it really is, and we're going to keep pushing.
Yes, they've tried to develop an antidote to the red pill, because obviously
they want to keep us on the blue pill, on the drugs.
Wikipedia doesn't want you to know what's happening in South Africa. YouTube will make this video difficult to find, and you've probably found that a lot of your previous interviews are hard to find now, and as a result, a lot of people aren't talking about what's happening in South Africa anymore. We've never forgotten what's going on there. We keep raising it. We're independent media, but it actually, funnily enough, it flared up again tonight on one of our local networks, Sky News, focusing on because the riots in the city, because the White Farm murders happening in rural area, but you can't ignore that the South African cities, they're turning into anarchy. It's a bit more hard for media to ignore.
Yes. Hopefully it'll continue that way. Unfortunately, the threat is that demographically speaking, by the time that our people wake up, it's going to be demographically too late.
Yeah.
And without intending to reduce this conversation to the lowest common denominator and, get all onto race and that kind of stuff,
we encourage that sort of thing here.
The simple fact is, people talk about the black cities in the USA, Baltimore, Atlanta, Detroit, Chicago, and others, which are a disaster. I mean, you've kind of got to see them to believe them, just how bad it really is. It's some parts of Detroit and Chicago are like inner city Johannesburg, literally. But besides those cities, there are other cities where the black vote may be, let's say, 20%. Yet the proportion of black mayors over time, obviously, is, say, 50 or 60 or 40%. And it's very easily explained. When black people or Muslim people vote, they vote in a block. They decide, we want to get Sadiq Khan in. We're all going to vote for Sadiq, even if we don't all terribly like him. Whereas we white people vote liberal, green, conservative, Australia first, this, that. I mean, we just cannot bring ourselves to stand in unison. So it doesn't require them to be, let's say, 75% of the population or even 50% of the population. When they reach a critical mass of 15, 20, 25%, with the support of dissident whites, they're able to achieve the critical mass required to get their candidate in. And you mentioned earlier what you might be, the future that you might be looking at in Australia. I can tell you now, guys, not because we're especially bright or clairvoyant or what have you, but because we've watched this movie before. things are going to get worse than you think that they will. I believe, and I say this with humility and in respect, I don't mean to patronize anybody, but I sincerely doubt that any Australian, true blue Australian, as it were, fully appreciates how this thing works. It doesn't require 50% of your population to be whatever. It only requires 20-25%. They then stick together, and then they start calling the shots while you all bicker, quarrel, argue, and fight with one another. And so they get their way. And that's how it is that they've been bold enough in Belgium. I don't remember whether it was 3 months ago or 4 months ago, but not so recently. There was a massive call from Muslims for Sharia law. Yeah. Because they have that critical mass now. They're in a position to say, we're not 2, 3, 4, 5, we're about 15% or 20%, and en masse, in unison, we're demanding this thing. Now you've got 5 or 6 white-dominated parties who can't agree on one single thing, and they exploit those fractures.
That's right. Well, if you look at the Russian Revolution, you had a very small proportion of foreign infiltrators who were actually able to basically hijack the entire country and cause the greatest genocide of the 20th century. Here in Australia, we actually had somebody, Fraser Anning, who was actually talking about Australians actually showing some in-group preference for each other. We had something like this 20 years ago when Pauline Hanson actually stood up and warned that Australia was in danger of being swamped by Asians. Whenever that's happened, the establishment, political parties and the media,
the white establishment,
the white establishment have always clamped down on that. Mind you, that white establishment, it's a very small proportion of Australians. If we go back to, say, after the Second World War here in Australia, it was the Labor Party. They opened up the floodgates to mass immigration. The Liberal Party didn't do anything to stop it, and then steadily, bit by bit, like the frog in the boiling frog, they just dismantled the White Australia policy, which had kept Australia as a white British European Christian nation. And now we're at the point now where we're not even allowed to criticize a Chinese woman who's been elected to parliament for her connections to the Chinese Communist Party without somebody saying that sounds like the White Australia policy. The whole problem for us is that we've actually been brainwashed into actually defeating ourselves, into actually carrying out essentially white genocide on ourselves.
And that seat schism that it was between the two major parties put forward two Chinese Australian candidates because it was a majority Chinese seat, and so it's a majority Chinese seat because when immigrants come to Australia, they don't just go here, there, here, just randomly. They congregate in the one area because the idea, like the actual process of multiculturalism, actually reinforces like ethnic nationalism. People like to be amongst their own. They congregate amongst their own race in the same geographical area. And so we've lost a seat, basically, one of 150 seats.
We've lost a geographial area,
And it's right near where we're broadcasting from.
Yeah. So, Simon, I've got a question, like talking about geographical areas. At XYZ, we've had some communication with people who are involved in the project to try to get an independent West Cape in South Africa. Because from what I understand, the West Cape, it's majority white and coloured. And there's a few of the regions are linguistically they're all related to each other as well. Do you have connections with them, and are you able to expand a bit on that?
Yes, sorry, I just want to ask Tyra, would you mind closing that door, please?
Yes, we saw a herder dog.
Thank you. This is actually a very, very deep and difficult subject. And the answer I'm going to give you is going to be completely counterintuitive. We are bitterly opposed to the secession of the Western Cape. But it's the explanation is very long and very deep. And sorry, let me just handle this matter. I beg your pardon.
Sure.
I'm ever so sorry, but
No
now the
problem.
dogs are inside and the door is closed, so it's twice as bad as it was before.
And we will get to, there's been a few questions, well, both from Master R. Forster. We'll get them for a moment. If you have a question to ask Simon, put it in entropy. And I've just launched a poll. What will happen to South Africa? Will it just go into anarchy, or will there be some form of foreign intervention? So have your say, well, speculation there.
Yeah, Simon, I don't mind you going into a bit of detail, because I've looked at this situation, and it seems, from what I've seen, it like the idea is that they think that they can have an independent state with white people in one area and coloured people in another area. And I'm like, well, what happens when the white area becomes more economically viable? Just say that they do get independence, and like they're going to need a wall as well. But yeah, I'm interested in your explanation.
Well, look, we were invited to participate in this thing.
Uh-huh.
So we went and held a long meeting with, the top guys. And the meeting ran for about 2 hours and 20 minutes or so. And for about 2 hours, as far as I was concerned, we spoke about meaningless things. So towards the end, I said to the gentleman in question, look, this is one of those situations in life in which the timing is more important than the event. What is most important to know here is, when do you intend seceding? And they said, when your civil war starts. In other words, when you're in a civil war and you're forming a buffer between us and death, then we're going to secede our own paradise. It is one of the most wicked things I have ever heard in my life. While my sons are shedding their blood on the Orange River in a civil war, then everybody in the Western Cape is going to create their little paradise. I tell you what, I have the thoughts of rage that are running through my mind now as I am reminded of that are just overwhelming. And about 5 minutes later, I said to the guy, look, please forgive me. I know you've answered already, but I just want to be dead sure that I understood you. When will you declare this secession? Because if you declare it today, the South African government is going to send its one remaining mechanized brigade into the Western Cape, shoot you all dead, and it's going to be a failure. He said, I already told you that we are waiting for your civil war to start. We are equally convinced that a civil war in South Africa is absolutely inevitable. And once your civil war begins, then we will secede. And he told me the same thing a third time. The other point worth mentioning is that this is an initiative fundamentally of globalists. It's fundamentally an initiative of big money, big capital, highly interlinked, which will obtain support from the United Nations. So it's although it appears superficially to be a nationalistic type of initiative, it is, on the contrary, it is very much a globalist initiative. And last but not least, this may not appeal to all of your listeners equally, but for those for whom it has some value, we believe in a certain series of prophecies that has been highly accurate over time. And that man said 100 years ago, watch out, because the globalists will set up a parallel government. They will usurp the whole situation. While you are at war, they will set up a government in Cape Town. And so this thing has been kind of prophesied and then told to us in simple English, sitting across a table in a restaurant, in Beaufort West is where the meeting happened, for anybody who knows where Beaufort West is in South Africa, in the Karoo semi-desert area. So we are so vehemently opposed to it. We are so bitterly resentful of it. I can barely tell you, that they should want to secede and create some little paradise. at the cost of my son's blood, so that they are insulated from the harsh reality of what is transpiring in South Africa, is enough to make me want to commit murder.
So are you concerned that basically the resistance, like the opposition to what's happening to white South Africans, is being divided? Like that there's maybe some controlled opposition?
Yes, certainly. There is a very strong globalist contingent in white South African society, and it has always been there. You know, if you consider the Anglo-Boer War, it was so dishonest, so deceitful, the way the war happened, and then how the mines were gained, and then how they were given off to such and such people, and you know how people lost their farms and never got them back. I mean, it was just an exercise in robbery, really. and that component remains in South African society. And one thing that may be of interest to people listening to this is that South Africa is not one of the most influential or powerful countries in the world. But if you imagine geopolitics as a monopoly game, and you take out, let's say, the top 20 countries of 194 countries in the world, and you make them the kids playing the monopoly game. Right, so the G20 is the players, the other 174 countries are the properties in the monopoly game. South Africa is not one of the top 20, and we will never be one of the top 20 most influential or powerful countries in the world. But 17% of the world's diamonds come from South Africa. In 2005, South Africa produced 100% of the world's chromium, and we still produce something like 90%. So if you removed all the chromium from the studio you're sitting in now, there would be precious little left of it. We produce 43% of the world's manganese. We have over 50% of the world's proven gold resources. We are the world's third largest exporter of coal. So we are arguably, outside of the 20 kiddies playing the monopoly game, we are arguably the most valuable property as a property on the board. We are a natural target for globalists.
Yes, yes.
And that kind of explains this almost exaggerated interest in certain spheres in South Africa.
Yeah, it's like you're a jewel, and it's a big incentive. Drawing a little bit on your talk of the prophecy, because I looked up the name because you mentioned it on the Red Ice radio. Sina van Rensburg or Regensburg.
You got it right the first time.
Rensburg, yeah. And then combining that with like just my knowledge of history, like if I consider the Spanish Civil War, where the conservatives pushed back against the communists, they called them the Republicans, but they were the communists, and
yes,
communists from all over the West flocked to Spain to fight for communism. And it just became a big thing. And then after that, like there were the veterans of the Spanish Civil War as well. I found it quite interesting that von Rensburg talks about sort of like an awakening. You were mentioning about how like when South Africa becomes a democracy, various aspects about Nelson Mandela, the Africans and Middle Easterners flooding into Europe, and Donald Trump coming to power, essentially. Basically talking about an awakening. And that's when things would kick off in South Africa. What I can foresee is a lot of red-pilled young white men flocking to South Africa in a similar way to which communists flocked to Spain during the Spanish Civil War to help you guys fight.
You're probably speaking to I'd say, the most red-pilled audience in Australia, because, well, the Unshackled and XYZ were considered by Wikipedia far-right literature in Australia.
Yeah, we'll send 40 over for you.
So yeah, we've got a lot of people who are commenting in the chat. You happy to take some questions from the audience?
Yes, certainly.
Yeah. So I've got two here from Master R. Forster. Should we start our own version of Zeitlanders in Australia, and what advice would you give to us in order to start doing so? We've already given you a bit of what's happening in Australia. It's a different threat to what's happening to you in South Africa, but yeah, it's something. And like I said, like there have been these rallies in Australia in support of white South African farmers, and the white people of Australia, they can tell where anti-white racism is going to lead to.
Yeah. You know, it's difficult to give advice on that question because your demographics are so very different to us, to ours, that I'm not sure that your problems will all transpire identically to ours. We spoke about something earlier on, such as trends in influence and in power and so on. That's inevitable. You get used to the idea. Whether a threat of violence would run along similar lines, I don't know, but I can tell you that there are 4 organizations in the USA that are building plans on the basis of our plan, on the exact basis. And there are probably 7 in Europe doing so. And we've provided them with lots of information. We've sent them our manual. We have a 250-page manual, which is really meant to serve our members. It's not meant to be a tactical level thing or a strategic level document. It's a personal operational document. But we've sent that to people, and they've gratefully received it, and they've started working on their own thing. I don't know whether you guys should form an organization similar to Suidlanders, but I can tell you this, that if there is a crisis in the world, such as seems to be slowly emerging, there's a book called Inside Europe by a man named John Gunther that was published in 1936 or 38, if I'm not mistaken. And if you read that book, it's a big, thick book, but if you read that book, you'll think to yourself, so much is so similar to the way events are transpiring in the Western world today, you know. And it seems as if there is a crisis, a real crisis, emerging in the West, for want of a better word. If that crisis does emerge, if there is a massive financial crisis that rocks the entire world, if markets fall and the demand for products doesn't exist, and the average Australian doesn't have a job because there's just no purpose. You know, you can open any shop you like, you're not going to have any customers because nobody has any money, that kind of thing. If there's 90% unemployment in Australia or 80% unemployment in Australia, that sort of thing, then you will certainly have to have cohesive groups of interdependent people based upon high trust relationships. In other words, the groups are going to have to be close. They're going to have to be interdependent. So you can't have 3 doctors. You need to have a doctor, and the doctor needs to have a baker. And the baker needs to have, you know, the man who provides the wood for the fire of the oven that does the baking. And those relationships are going to have to be built on very high trust. And it sounds all very melodramatic and end of the world apocalyptic scenarios and so on. But that's fundamentally what Suidlanders is about. We believe that there is one almighty cataclysm that is going to hit us sooner or later, and that the trajectory of the West cannot continue as it is now ad infinitum without a severe fracturing. And if you guys are affected in some way, then you're going to desperately want some plan to band together in a group of 100 families and defend one another at any cost.
Well, there's been talk of doing that. There are a few clubs and societies, but it's still in the early infancy. One thing that I think we should touch on is that last Friday, Robert Mugabe, the dictator of Zimbabwe, which used to be Southern Rhodesia, died at the age of 95, not in Zimbabwe, in Singapore, we should say. Yes. And there was a lot of celebration here in Australia. I noticed from just people in my circle, there some of the media tried to gloss over his genocide and displacement of the people there, but there was quite a lot of realism there, and our Public Broadcasting Corporation, the ABC, they actually did quite an accurate one where that Robert Mugabe actually murdered more blacks than under white rule.
Yeah, for sure. The North Korean trained 5th Brigade killed something like 30,000 people. Estimates vary, but 30,000 is a nice, middle of the road number. And there was no war. There was no counter conflict. So when I say that the 5th Brigade murdered, it is a matter of record that they walked up to people and shot them in the brain, just as simple as that. Murdered. It wasn't a war. There was no battle. It wasn't about each side having guns and doing their best and the one blaming the other. It was murder, pure and simple. And that is a fact of history, which is, as you rightly say, Tim, that has been conveniently glossed over by the BBC and others.
Yeah, we never got taught any of this. Like even what you're telling me now. Like I've studied history like at university, and I've unlearnt everything I learnt at university. I've never heard that. This is why I often refer to the red pill rage. Like I hear something like that, and I'm like, why have I never been told that? Something that I've also there was a report just a couple of weeks ago talking about the new government. Well, like the government in Rhodesia now. Since Mugabe's gone, and they're still torturing people. They're still brutalizing political prisoners.
Oh yeah. There's a famous phenomenon in Zimbabwe, and this, by the way, is the gospel truth. I've been there many times. I mean, I know many other people who will tell you this story or similar stories. In South Africa, if you have a ute, and let's say you go shopping, and you put all your groceries on the back of the ute, and then you go to another shop, the chances of them being stolen are very, very, very high. If you go to Zimbabwe and you do the same, the chances of your groceries being stolen off the back of your ute are nil. Absolutely zero. Because people are too terrified to go to jail in Zimbabwe. And it's a very well-known thing. Firstly, your relatives have to provide your food. For starters, they don't feed you, right?
Jeez.
Secondly, 60 people to a small room, taking turns standing and sitting and lying down in rotation because the room is too small. It's not a bundle of fun. Never mind the sanitary conditions, because they don't provide toilet paper. Not maybe, not could be, not possibly, not perhaps. They don't provide toilet paper. So 60 guys in one cell sharing the same toilet without toilet paper, it's a bit touch and go. But, when you can't even sleep at the same time, or all stand at the same time, or all sit at the same time, and you pray to God that your relatives have got enough money to bring you food, the crime in Zimbabwe is almost unheard of, because the consequences of being caught far outweigh the whatever chance you may believe that you have of getting away with it.
We have got a super chat that's just come through from Maddie's Modern Life, $3 US. Thank you, Maddie, for paying it forward. Save the Boer. Who was it that subverted the country? Oh, that's right. It was the tribe. Is Simon Roche J-woke yet? Don't let them into the West Cape, mate. Just don't do it. Maddie's he's one of our contributors to the show every few weeks. So do you want to respond to that?
I'd prefer not to. We prefer not to get into the JQ. Our situation is so tenuous. We are so embattled. We are such a tiny minority that it's a moot question for us. Occasionally, our founder and leader, Mr. Gustav Müller, and I will sit and chat, and we'll talk about this and about that, and we'll debate things and what have you, but we don't even permit ourselves to become fascinated by the JQ. It's like saying, I've got 10 wives, for argument's sake. I'm the emperor of Persia, and I've got a whole harem, and I've got problems with 9 wives, so I'm going to go and find a way to open a dispute with the 10th, because I just don't have enough damn grey hairs. No, for us, it's moot. Maybe the Jews are behind it. Maybe the Jews are. We've got little girls being raped on farms.
Yeah, that's a good point, and it puts it all in perspective. Another question which you might be able to answer is the Afrikaner resistance movement, the AWB, still active in South Africa? Are you familiar with that?
Yes, the AWB is, I don't really want to say too much about them, purely and simply because they're I don't mean this in a negative way, but like rugby teams or cricket teams can be rivals, so too they are a rival of a sort of ours. And it's not nice when rivals have too much of an opinion on one another. And they don't disparage us, and they don't slander us, and they don't talk too much about us, and we mind our business, they mind theirs. So I will limit myself to saying this, that the AWB was so successfully demonized, it was so heavily infiltrated, that it was destroyed from the inside out. It still exists. They still have a few thousand members. They still hold true to the principles and policies of the past, but the government and its agencies did a very good job of eviscerating them, unfortunately.
Lessons for us.
And we've got one more question. Whites, this is from Master R. Forster. Whites globally have a lot to learn from South Africa. They have experienced what we have yet only feared will come, which we've already touched on that quite a bit already.
Yeah.
One thing, because we are running out of time, we're nearly up to the end of the second hour, what was happening to the white farmers in South Africa, I mentioned that it was helped in Australia by mainstream media attention, but obviously there was Lauren Southern's Farmlands documentary that was available for free on YouTube. You were assisted with that, and also Katie Hopkins, she visited the white farms in South Africa. Now, they're attacked for being not real journalists, and well, as a result, Lauren Southern, she's retired for personal reasons, and Katie Hopkins, no one in the UK will hire her anymore. So to get, it's good that there has been that publicity, but it's so the people that brought it out, it was there was a lot of barriers thrown in their way.
Yeah, it's very, very sad, but South Africa is the darling of the global initiative to undermine Western culture as a salient, successful entity. It is clear that much of what has poisoned Western society over, you can name a period, 1913, the Federal Reserve Act. You can go back before that. You can go to the Immigration Act of 64, 65 in the USA. There are any number of dates that you can use. But we all have a fair idea of what we're talking about here. Over a certain period of time, the core values of European-derived, Christian-based society have been attacked and eroded to the point now where it's teetering. And it is clear that has been injected from externally. Very few of us spontaneously woke up and decided that we wanted to adopt whatever X, Y, and Z liberal value. It had to be rammed down our throats for years and years on end before it got traction. And even then, it really only got traction. Name any matter you want. They really only got traction when the media and the academic and political elites began saying, oh yes, this matter has traction. Oh yes, we all think like this now. You must be in the Stone Age, when it simply wasn't true. So, without a long-winded answer, I'm looking at the clock on my computer, and you are running out of time, as you said. I think that what I've said now gives an insight into what you're talking about. There is this external force that has endeavored to destroy us and now has the upper hand. And it is affecting all of us. And if we don't begin to stand together for our culture, our identity, our mommies and our daddies, our language and our faith, what has worked well for us for so long, we will be destroyed, because we are perceived to be the enemy of Islam. We are perceived to be the enemy of the impoverished blacks. We are perceived to be the enemy of liberalism. If we don't stand strong now, it is going to be game over for us. The writing is on the wall.
Well said. Well said.
And one final question is, obviously the South African government, the African National Congress policy hasn't changed of expropriating white farms without compensation. The argument for this is to make sure that inequality is narrowed, and so that there's a more just racial representation of who owns the nation. So how is that process now unfolding? We should get back to, I think.
Tim, let me begin by saying that the whole thing doesn't make any damn sense, because for 19 years post-apartheid, for 19 years since Saint Nelson Mandela, took over the reins of government of South Africa, we had a process in which every last land claim was addressed. There were campaigns up and down the country. There were billboards. There were advertisements in newspapers, advertisements on radio, advertisements in television. I don't know if you have in Australia those little mobile libraries in certain areas where they turn a little truck into a library and it goes to perhaps rural places, once a week, and you can climb in the truck and get a library book. They had similar things, similar trucks that drove the length and the breadth of South Africa to provide an in situ service for anybody who wanted to make a land claim. For 19 years, every single last land claim was addressed. So firstly, this thing is spurious. It's spurious to begin with. But now, let's say the 25,000 racist, maniac, evil, running dog, white farmers, being the selfish people that they are, let's say that their farms could in fact support far more people. Let's say where a farm is supporting a family of 4 or 5 whites, black people being far more innovative and productive and less selfish and so on, could be accommodated at a much greater rate. Let's say we're 4 or 5 whites on a farm, or it's sustainable, 4 or 5 whites, 100 blacks can be sustained, right? There are 25,000 farms. Do the maths. We're a country of 60 million people. 2.5 million people are going to get these farms. What about the rest? It doesn't even make any sense at all.
It's not
You're going to
supposed
satisfy
right?
2.5 million people that don't have land. And besides which, I'd like to point out to you that, for example, the largest ethnic group in South Africa is the Amazulu people, which are around about 10 million people, and they form around about 20% of our population, officially. There is this idea that the blacks have no land. The Zulu people in the province of KwaZulu-Natal own 32% of the land as a nation, besides any land that any Zulu man may own as a farmer. I'm not saying that that's not disproportionate. Yes, there are fewer white farmers who own a lot, or fewer whites who own a lot. But it's not 3.2%. It's not 9%. It's 32% of that province, for example, is owned just by the Zulu nation as a nation. Over 50% of the Eastern Cape province is owned by Xhosa people. So it's not quite what they make it out to be. You know, this whole argument, it doesn't make any sense. The process has already been completed. The maths doesn't make any sense. The numbers involved that the liberal media quotes are simply false, and so the story goes on. And anybody can verify anything that I've said.
We've just got one last super chat again from Maddie's Modern Life. Here is $3 for Simon to start the 100% Bavarian phenotype ethno-state in the West. Tim, if you don't send this to him, you're officially a tribesman. Now say this based. Now, before you go, how can, because there's a lot of people watching who want to help Suidlanders, so
Yes.
how can they assist you either financially or through other means?
Well, we have a very good plan. We have many members. Our training is superb. Our knowledge and skills and experience are advanced. Our one weakness is financial. I don't like begging. Personally, it embarrasses me. Our leader doesn't like begging. But the only need we have, the only shortcoming that we have is financial. And we humbly ask people to support us. PayPal shut us down about 3 weeks ago. So there are two ways of making donations to us. The one is to a Wells Fargo bank account in the USA, and the other is to our South African bank account. Anybody who's interested in doing so can find the details, certainly of the Wells Fargo bank account, on our website, Suidlanders.org, S-U-I-D, landers.org, Suidlanders.org. The bank account details are there, and you can make an international SWIFT transfer nowadays very, very easily, and we gratefully receive such help. We're also still able to receive Bitcoin for anybody who's able to help us in that way. We would appreciate it. And an EFT, an electronic financial transfer to our South African bank account, is also not a difficult thing to do. If anybody doesn't understand, if they've got a query or whatever, they may email HK. It's that easy. HK@suidlanders.co.za. HK@suidlanders.co.za. And there's a lovely lady by the name of Tyra who will gladly assist.
And we'll put the links to those in the description of this video and also on the show notes page. It's been good to catch up with you again, Simon. We haven't forgotten. We will never forget what's going on in South Africa. So I'm glad that you're able to come on and to our audience and give us the on the ground, well, what is still happening in South Africa.
It has been our great pleasure, and we thank you for it. Tim and David, it was very nice to meet you.
Very nice to meet you too, Simon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for allowing our voice to be heard and permitting us to circumvent the treachery of the mainstream media. May you guys go from strength to strength as you tell the truth and you garner greater and greater and greater support, robbing it from the media barons in Australia and elsewhere.
Well, that's why we're here. Take care, Simon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
The Uncuckables.